Classes in Game Design, based on the books by George Phillies and Tom Vasel. Design elements of contemporary strategy games and contemporary perspectives in game design, both from Third Millennium Publications, http 3mpub.com/Phillies. And today, this lecture is Lecture 8. I'm Professor Phillies. This course is IMGD 2500, Design of Tabletop Strategy Games. This is actually Lecture 8. Lecture 7 was the lab you did yesterday. What I'm going to do is to talk about a few more of the 6 elements, the 6 basic elements that you put into games. In particular, I'm going to talk about shape, I'm going to talk about voice, and I'm going to talk about themes. So what is shape? Shape is how much of your life the game occupies. At the bottom end we have, let's see, scissors, paper, rocks, which you can play in a few instances. And if you have an incredible resistance to boredom, you can play it time after time after time and hope that your opponent did not pre-memorize a random number sequence, which will guarantee they win. However, that's sort of at the bottom end. At the top end, we have a game, organized game with a defined conclusion, like Campaign for North Africa. Campaign for North Africa, the map is around 5 by 8 feet. There are around 2,000 or 3,000 unit counters. A reasonable group of players is about 10. 1 or 2 players on each side are people who love railroad planning and accounting, because the logistics rules require 1 or 2 full-time people to do the logistics calculations, without which the units run out of food or water or fuel or ammunition. The battle game in question is set in the North African desert at the early part of World War II, and you hit rules that are sufficiently detailed that, well, you cannot use the other guy's ammunition in your weapons. And by the way, while most countries' armies turned wheat into bread for food, the Italian army used pasta, which is fine until you work out how much water you need to boil all that pasta. It is a major supply issue, just as it was for the real Italians. And you can play it in, 100 or several hundred hours if you're efficient. There are people who like to do this. So there's a scale. There are also, you get this more in role-playing games, games that do not have a well-defined end. You just keep playing. They're like some of the Japanese anime series that go on forever and ever and ever. Dungeons and Dragons' original version was a good notion of this. Of course, some people now play scenario books, which tend in some cases to be very much like linear march-throughs of the sort you see in dungeon-crawling computer games. So that, in a sense, is what shape is. But we can talk about shape in terms of other things. How big is the game board? How many unit counters are there? How many players do you need? What investment do the players need to make in order to know the rules? At one end, you've played Carcassonne, you've played Puerto Rico, the rules in normal 12-point type would be a modest number of pages, and you were all able to learn the rules fairly quickly. At the other end, we have Advanced Squad Leader. The basic rule book to Advanced Squad Leader in 10-point type, 2 columns, not a lot of white space, is over 140 pages. That does not include any of the additional rules in some of the later books. It does not include the supplemental rules for playing particular scenarios, so the basic rules are fairly detailed. For example, there is a half page of rules on making transits through sewers, which you can do in some European countries, and the extremely deleterious health effects of actually going through the sewers. You need to recover for quite some time afterwards if you live through it, especially if you don't have gas protection. So we have ranges of rules. You can put in shape in terms of other factors, and you can go. Anyone want to suggest one? Okay. Eurogames, which I said are defined by their shape. The strategy is defined by a small number of simple but difficult choices. The choices are difficult because resource constraints are clearly dominant. The extreme case is Puerto Rico. You're going to choose a role. You can only choose one role in a given round, and it will give you a very slight advantage over everyone else, assuming you don't choose a role that helps them more than it helps you. And as a result, the role choice, yeah, there's thought, but it's not something where you have lots of decisions to make. At the other end, a game, this would be a board war game again, something like Fire in the East or Drongnach Osten. You have several thousand unit counters on a side. You get to move all of them during the turn, and the number of decisions you must make is not choose one, but oh my, do I have a lot to choose. Eurogames, as I said, are defined by their shape. Playing time, rules difficulty, size and complexity of the game. A less prominent sort of thing is the choice of colors and the thematic elements. You've seen that in both games. There are a lot of things that are sitting there in both games, but the color doesn't actually change the gameplay. If you used unit counters numbered 1 through 5 instead of the little colored barrels of corn or indigo, they'd be exactly the same, but it really would be a different game in terms of its feel. That's shape. There are other things you can do. I'm going to look at board war game design objectives for a second. And these are objectives that fit the shape of the game. Board games, well, also miniatures, games with toy soldiers. Also many computer games, same issue. Also some role-playing games, especially, I'll get to how D&D was originally played in a moment. And so you have such questions as the size of the game, the size of the map, the number of unit counters, the rules complexity, how long the game is going to run. There's something called coarse graining. We'll get to that in more detail later. The notion in coarse graining is how much detail do you put into the rules? And on one hand, you may put in, okay, a tank shooting at another tank, you need to roll at least an 8 on 2d6 to destroy the other tank. On the other hand, you have rules where, okay, that is a 75 millimeter long. It has a penetration of 138 millimeters of standard armor, and we can put in the trig function. I mean that literally for the angle, because you're going through the armor at an angle. And we have incredible detail. We do not, however, have incredible realism. I once got to ask someone who manufactured ordnance, well, how reproducible is that 138 millimeters if you fire a bunch of rounds? And the answer for Army, the Navy, is much more precise because you have to hit the enemy ship using indirect fire, is, plus or minus 50%. And so the very fine detail looks impressive and is extremely precise, but is not very realistic. Okay, then there are questions like game balance. And there is a traditional three-point direction here. And what are the three-point directions? Well, one is the notion of what is called realism. That is, the game should reproduce the historical campaign as much as possible. This doesn't have to be a board war game. It could be a game about railroads. It could be a game about competing shipping companies or merchant bankers or whatever. A second side of this is what might be called play interest. If the game is so realistic that there's only one choice at each move for each action, yeah, it reproduces history totally accurately. It's almost as good as a videotape, except in a VCR you can lean back to watch, and with this you have to move the counters yourself. Play interest says players have choices to make, and they're interesting choices. That's what makes a game. There was also something called play balance. And the notion is that if you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 players, they all have something like the same chance to win. If you look at Puerto Rico, well, you might say, gee, whoever moves first has a bit of an advantage, don't they? Well, they do to an extent, except you notice because of the turn rotation, first they take a turn, then everyone else takes a turn, and now the mayor moves, the governor moves, and everyone else takes a turn, and now they finally get their second turn. And you notice that advantage of moving first has just been squinched a bit. So there's play balance. There's also accuracy, which is not necessarily the same thing as realism. We won't have much time to talk about that. And there's this competition as to what the game is supposed to be doing. Third point, a completely different sort of shape. Cooperative games. And cooperative games, the bulk of them, are in fact linked to role games. I shall go somewhat back in time to, say, 1974, when Dungeons & Dragons first came out. It was a set of miniatures rules, and you had a character, and as it was locally interpreted, you typically had some number of minions with you, 40 of them. And if you were really stupid, you went into a dungeon. The 4 guys and their 160 minions who tried this on a random rolled minion dungeon had several survivors. However, it was played as a competitive game. In fact, there were several occasions on which I saw we will line up several D&D characters, or a number of them, and we will line up armies and have at each other in battles. A medieval army plus first edition magicians is an incredible bloodbath, but it doesn't last very long. Having said that, at some point people realized I have this character and I will identify with it. And as you go on forward, you have characters and they are given backgrounds and histories and personality quirks. This is what the players are doing. And the players are identified with their characters, and unsurprisingly, they would get really annoyed if another player were to notice, I need 2,000 eeps to make 5th level. You're standing right in front of me, aren't you? I can't imagine why there's this dagger coming out of the front of your stomach. Thank you for your 2,500 eeps. You can do this. I describe backstabbing literally, but this sort of behavior rapidly leads to negative consequences. Or it leads to games masters who realize why reincarnation spells should be really cheap to avoid getting people mad at each other and keep the campaign going. That is role gaming, and the game becomes cooperative because the cost of competing with each other in a literal manner, as opposed to who can pile up the most loot or whatever, the cost of competing in a lethal manner becomes so high that people are not willing to do it. Or the person who does this discovers mutual assured destruction, namely the other players, without telling them, have made a deal that if someone stabs them in the back, they will all gang up on the stabber and make him dead. Having said this, that is a role-playing game. You can see the same effect in LARPs, where people, in a well-designed large LARP, people do identify with their character. By the time you get to Society of Creative Anachronism, which puts together role-playing and improv theater, it basically is, and foot battles that are actually medieval scale or close, 5 or 8, 10,000 people involved. That's a medieval scale battle. People are very much identified with their characters. Another shape, a game that is heavily determined by player interaction, diplomatic games. I've talked about diplomacy. How many of you have played diplomacy? Risk is somewhat similar. Bunches of you have played Risk. In Risk, there's much more combat because if you have a moderate advantage in force, the forces are fine-grained, you can attack a neighboring province and have some reasonable shot of succeeding. In diplomacy, there are what are called stalemate lines, and if you hold all of one side of the stalemate line, no possible attack can cross it because no attack can get enough of an advantage in force to push ahead. That's actually rather like World War I until the Germans invented Stoßtaktik. However, you have a game, and the important issue is talk. Talk is what is paramount. You interact with other people to get an advantage. The very first computer games that were really played on a computer that are still around to be played, that's Battle Plan and Star Web. Battle Plan has now been being played for 40 years. The 40th anniversary of the computer being used is coming up. And yes, you can play it, and there is skill involved, but diplomacy with 10 or 15 people on the board is a major part of actually getting towards a victory or a group victory. And what is, I guess, the core piece of that? Is it diplomacy? Is it computers? No, all of the games I just mentioned, and we can go back to add diplomacy to this, the core piece of the shape is central processing of simultaneous moves. Everyone talks, everyone acts, and the action is not something that happens piece by piece, so that the diplomacy works fairly well. Okay, so I have talked about shape. One could go on more, but I have other things to discuss. And one of the other things I am going to discuss is actually an English literature idea, and the two pieces are called voice and tense. By voice, I'm referring to first person, second person, third person, and then there's singular and plural. If you say, I am playing this game and therefore I must represent a single person, well, if it's a role game and there are 5 miniatures on the table representing the 5 player characters, each player does whatever the one character is, and there's total character identification. And that's for really first person singular. When the games master forwards the 500 orcs, he may say, we attack. That's first person plural. And in some sense, the games master is identifying with his soon-to-be dead or soon-to-be victorious creatures, but it's first person. You say, I. However, that is a very narrow point of view on how you can do things. The very large board games I've mentioned, you are not playing a single role. If you are playing something that is, say, a large Russian front game, you are representing whoever is commanding each side, and you are representing the army group, the front commanders, and the army commanders, and the corps commanders, and at some point down there, eventually you have only single units, and they don't really do anything except what they're told to. And so you are representing something plural, and you are not imagining that you are Zhukov or Boudeni or von Manstein or whoever, unless you're viewed by your fellow gamers as being a bit nuts. You are actually simply representing, we are doing this, and you're somewhat not attached to what is going on. What about second person, you? Where on earth would you see a you in a game? The answer is most of you actually have. The door opens. You see a stairway leading up. There's the you. You are slightly confused because the stairway goes up for hundreds of feet and the peasant cottage surrounding it is only 6 feet tall. But there is the you. Now, that's very heavily done in computer games. It is very difficult to find examples of literary prose that are written in second person. I tried writing some once. I've written a few novels. I've done other things. I tried writing some once, and all I can tell you is it very rapidly becomes very heavy-handed, both on the reader and on the author. It does not work well in written prose very often, except, of course, in conversation between two characters. You will go to the tower, and you will open the door, and you will throw in this convenient atomic hand grenade of Antioch and close the door again. That's second person imperative, but it's not really writing in second person. Oh, first person plural. Almost forgot that one. There are a lot of campaigns that I am aware of, role gaming campaigns, in which you have 3 or 4 players, but if you look at the player characters on the table, there are a dozen of them because everyone is playing 2 or 3 characters at once. And this gives somewhat larger combats and somewhat more inter-character interaction. That's second person plural. There are a few other things, though, you can do in writing. I mentioned third person. Modern writers talk very heavily about point of view and staying fixed on point of view. So if you have a chapter or a section, it's written from the point of view of a single identifiable character. The alternative to that, we could imagine, say, we're going to describe a poker game. And each character, each player will speak and say what they do. But after or before each person speaks, there will be a whole paragraph where the person in question is calculating the odds, and therefore each paragraph is from a different point of view of a different player running in a circle. Now, if you want to write that, you have to be very careful how you write it so that the poor reader always knows which player, which card player I mean, is showing the point of view at the moment. You can do things. However, there are other alternatives that are less popular. And I will take a paragraph, actually it's really only a sentence, from an English writer of 1830, a man who in his own time was viewed as being the greatest living Victorian author. You have undoubtedly heard the first 7 words only of the paragraph, but I'm going to give you the whole thing. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals, when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets. For it is in London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness. And that is, of course, from Sir Edward George Bulwer-Lytton, the novel Paul Clifford. Now, the reason I introduced that, in addition to showing you what a good Victorian author sounded like, is that middle phrase, for it is in London that our scene lies. There's no person here. There's no one thinking that. That is the author himself speaking. The style is called authorial omniscient. And if you really want to irritate a large number of people who espouse modern writing styles, just start praising it at them. What happens? For it is in London that our scene lies. The author himself, his voice, reaches out through the fourth wall, grabs you by the throat, and tells you exactly where you are. None of this subtlety, none of this little paragraph bit at the top telling you a date and place and time. That style works good, but that's actually also sort of authorial omniscient. The author is speaking, and in mid-text you suddenly hear the author himself addressing you. Okay, last piece. Tense. This will be more relevant to those of you who are writing a game in which you have large numbers of, say, cards with blocks of text on them. And the players must read the text, or you're reading one of these choose-your-own-book adventure novels in which you branch and go various places. Those of you who read science fiction or detective novels or cowboy novels or modern detective novels or almost anything except modern literary novels will notice that everything you read is actually written in past tense. There was a sudden silence on the battlefield. From north to south, not a sound could be heard. Rain fell from the sky in torrents. You notice I'm always speaking in past tense, even though I'm describing what is happening at the moment. That is a style, a choice, which if you're doing text blocks you should probably but not necessarily use, which is very popular among what is sometimes called genre fiction or romantic fiction. Romantic fiction is not the same as romance novels, though romance novels are romantic fiction. The alternative is to write in present tense. You see a stairway leading up. Rolling down the stairway is a giant barrel of wine filling the width of the stairway. Its sounds pounda, pounda, pounda as it rolls towards you. Deafen your ears. This is Indiana Jones, except someone did the design a bit better. In any event, you notice I was speaking in present tense. There are literary novels which, and if you look for a bit, you'll find them, it's present tense as the standard writing style. There is a fellow by the name of Modesit. He's actually a science fiction writer. He will show up at the regional conventions because he's sort of in the area, or was in the area anyhow. And he will lecture on this and explain the dramatic differences between what qualifies as good science fiction writing and what qualifies as good literary writing, as stated from someone who is not going to be insulting and demeaning towards either group of people. He also did a series of novels, it's Spellsinger, in which he uses both style. The good guys get the past tense. The bad guys and the opponents, some of whom aren't really bad, get the present tense. So that is tense. And if you are writing text and you are going to be describing scenes or what has happened or happened, it is one of the two things you should be aware of other than voice. Voice, as I just demonstrated, is also something you can use in games. Oh yes, the bottom end of authorial omniscient. If your character does that, you will ruin the scenario, except that I'll kill your character first. That's authorial omniscient, and it's sort of the bottom feeding version. Okay. So we have talked about voice and tense, and we have talked about shape, which most game designers won't say much about. And I guess we get to push ahead to theme. Theme is what you get told if you ask a representative person, what's the game about? And they will talk about theme. They will talk about the 2 paragraphs you slap on the back of the box or the back of the paperback, the thing that lures people in so they're interested in playing it. Theme, however, is what is called by an author the plot hook. The plot hook is not the plot. The plot is the great Soviet novel of 1937, complete with 400 pages on the great 5-year plans. That's the thing I talked about in the first lecture, which, God forbid, I've never had to read, thank God. In any event, having said that, the plot hook for that was spies and heroes and heroines. So there are now concrete themes. And there are a vast number of them. Business and commerce. And if you say, I am choosing a game about business and commerce, well, it could be a straight auction game. One of you brought up Masterpiece, which is an excellent example. It could be a game about real estate investing. It could be Bootlegger, which is an area control game of speakeasies during Prohibition selling illicit alcohol. But it's business, and there is a theme with money and goods going back and forth in some sense.
Would Puerto Rico kind of fall under that then?
Puerto Rico would fall under it, and it really is business. And there's some economic development as a mechanism. You can build things that help you on. But it's basically a business and commerce game. Yes? Okay. Biology. Biology gives you all sorts of things that you would not expect as games, but some of them do quite well. For example, there is Grow, Battle for the Petri Dish. Your colonies of bacteria mutating, trying to take control of everything. That actually does quite well. It's an area control game. Or you have something like Penguin Ultimatum, which you must read the full description. It's in Design Elements. And it's a competition to throw a party. I guess you could say it's a competition to throw a party. You could also have Mammoth Hunter. And Mammoth Hunter are, as you expect, groups of people pursuing large elephants. But it's in fair part actually really biology. Okay. Economic development. We have business and commerce. We have economic development where your emphasis is on things to improve your position. And eventually you have full economies. And the line here is that when you really have a full economy, you have functioning markets that respond to what you're doing. Those are hard to do. Look at the success, look at your playtest reports for your Puerto Rico variants. You all, I'm fairly sure, worked respectably hard on those variants. They all looked like there'd been some thought put into them. However, getting something that works well and represents a whole economy is difficult. Well, it's difficult unless you do something like SimCity, where you simply toss in 10,000 agents, and the agents all behave quasi-rationally, and then you really do have an economy. Okay. Crime. Clue, the detective. Kill Dr. Lucky. How did this guy get killed? Well, Kill Dr. Lucky is the people trying to pull it off. Any number of bootlegging and dope smuggling and God knows what else games, down to that misfortunate car robbery game, computer game, that's crime. It's a theme. We've talked about Old West. We've talked about pirates. Those are themes. Oh, very popular theme. Railroads. The most common version of the railroad game is we start off at ground zero and you start laying track. And by cleverly laying track from point to point, you build up a business empire. However, once upon a time, someone looked at this and said, it doesn't have to be railroad tracks. I'll do clipper, and it's ships and trade routes. So you don't have to put down railroad tracks. They don't float very well anyhow. But it's a track-laying game. It looks much like a railroad game, but it isn't. Railroad games are incredibly popular. Then, of course, there are geographic places. It helps if the potential players have ever heard of the place. So you get games, Roman gladiatorial games, ancient Rome games, because people know about ancient Rome. On the other hand, when I brought up alternatives for Japan, in addition to the samurai earlier late period and more or less modern Japan, well, I didn't really cover more or less modern Japan because it could be a detective thing. It could be a variant on Vampire Princess Miyu. It could be a variant on Tank Police. That is, any of these anime things. It's not this is realistic or has anything to do with the place in question. It is that you have an audience that knows what they're getting. On the other hand, when I brought up Heian period Japan and The Shining Prince, anyone in here recognize the name until I brought it up? Oh, good. That's an above average count. We are at 1000 AD. You could imagine doing a literary game, though there's very peculiarity. The men had all studied Chinese and wrote in Chinese, not in Japanese, and wrote in styles that would have met approval across the water. All of the Japanese language novels and the Japanese were written by women like Shikubu Murasaki or Sho Shinagon. I am undoubtedly butchering the pronunciations. And there were two literary scenes at the same time. Well, that'd be very different as a place, but you should realize a lot of players have never heard of them. Okay. Sports. And when we talk about sports, there is a vast amount of range for coarse or fine graining. A good example is provided by, for example, football games. And at the very coarse-grained, you have something like the old Avalon Hill football strategy where the ball goes back and forth. There are no players on the field. You just call plays. On the fine grain, there are the traditional stratomatic games where every player has a card. The cards actually resemble the real named players, meaning the company is shelling out a fortune to the NBA or the NFL, etc., for rights. And, gee, you have a sports game. You also have the original collectible card game. The original collectible card game was not Magic: The Addiction. If you go back to the 1950s, there were what were called bubblegum trading cards with pictures of baseball players on them. And it really was almost entirely baseball players at that time. And associated with the cards, if you looked carefully, there was a game. And the cards let you do things in the game. I never heard of anyone who played it. In fact, I'm not sure I remember anyone even noticing that there was a game on the cards, but there was a game on the cards. That's sports gaming. Okay, so we have pushed ahead, and we have talked about themes. And if you work hard for a bit, you can probably find a wide variety of additional themes. Oh yes, politics. And at one point, this goes back to the 80s, so it was either the 88 or the 92 election. The game was sufficiently detailed so that you could sort of recognize the actual contestants, except it was written 4 years before the election. And it predicted the outcome of the election. I've now forgotten which election it was. I suspect it was the election of '84. And it did a very accurate job, except if in 1980 you asked who will be running for president in 1984, almost everyone was convinced that Reagan was going to be a one-term president. Because of his age, he was going to retire. Wrong. And if he didn't retire, the Democrats were going to beat him into the ground. Reagan-Mondale was one of the least balanced elections we have ever had. The game got it right. Well, that's sort of, if you write games about the more or less contemporary period, one of the things that can happen is that you can predict the near future. Okay, I have said some words about theme. Theme eventually leads. Does someone want to suggest some more themes? Shall I give the class a chance to think of a few? Yes, someone? You're going to have to speak up. There's too much background noise.
Fantasy and sci-fi. Sorry?
Yes?
Fantasy and sci-fi. They're not.
Oh, of course! Yes! How could we have missed, probably fairly easily, fantasy, science fiction, in general, any genre novel type. Mind you, I cannot offhand think of large numbers of games about romance novels. There are only a fairly modest number of games about vampires and such not, the things that overrun science fiction bookshelves at the moment. However, fantasy, science fiction, we've mentioned westerns, detectives. Yes?
Exploration games?
Wonderful example, exploration. The original Dungeons and Dragons, unless you were suicidal and went into a dungeon, was primarily an exploration game. You went out and saw a world you'd never seen before, and if you were clever, you didn't starve to death along the way, and you essentially occupied the imagination of the games master. And so it was like walking into a novel, except what you did affected what happened in the novel. Excellent example. Question?
Actually, I was going to suggest historical wars.
Okay, that's a good example. Theme, history. And it certainly includes war. It includes other things. It can include colonization. It can include historical developments. If we include the interesting game, which I've mentioned, Credo, it includes theology, but it's a historical period.
What those like media conversion things that's themed off of a existing like show or book or whatever?
That's a good point. I've said that media conversion is a physical style, but it's also a theme. The media conversion. It's a game about, I don't know, Desperate Housewives, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, something like that. Any more themes?
Just general abstract games like poker.
Ah, yes. Very important. I'm going to make it a little more general than your suggestion.
Abstract.
Abstract. Themeless. Go, Othello, Mancala type games. Vast numbers of alternatives. Questions? Yes?
And mystery games like would fit under crime, correct?
I would say mystery and crime are sort of coincident. Crime is a little more general. There are a lot of games in which people, Grand Theft Auto, play the criminals. Sometimes to the great disturbance of law and order types. I suspect if people were clever, they would come up with some other themes. Oh, I remember last year someone made the point, which I will simply repeat. This goes back too far for most of you to remember. How did VCR players get off the ground? In large numbers of states where the police did not object, the local store had VCRs and you could rent movies. And you could also, from behind the counter, rent XXX-rated movies, pornography. And in fact, I gather, though I have never, thank God, seen an example, there are games of the same sort that are actually board games as opposed to what you would reasonably expect. Questions?